result of misguided government agencies acting under the direction of government ministers who are equally culpable in denying mothers and their babies proper duty and care. Let me be clear, as I said earlier in my speech, it was right and overdue to issue an apology to Indigenous Australians. But it is now time, indeed past time, to issue a similar and appropriate apology to white mothers. When one talks to these white mothers, it is clear that time has not dulled the pain and anguish they have suffered. Indeed, from my early experience in talking to these mothers, they still suffer intensely today. Compounding the pain has been in many instances the acute awareness and realisation that in reunions with their siblings, now adults, they have been accused of abandoning them because they did not love them. Why did you give me away? Did you not love me? Has been the question many of these mothers have had to answer, and indeed the young ones, now adults, in many instances have never forgiven them. Of course, there have also been many reunions where siblings have understood, but as mothers will tell you, those childhood years can never be recaptured. Where to from here? Importantly, the story of these mothers need to be told so that there is a recognition of the extent of these injustices and they can be better understood. I've always said that you're halfway to the solution of a problem when there is a recognition in the first instance of that problem. The Parliamentary Report Recommendation 20 highlights this approach wherein it states the Minister for Community Services should establish a public education campaign on the effects of past adoption practices. Chris Cole herself concludes, and I quote, in reference to recommendations 16, 17 and 20, and she states, and these recommendations are some of them I've referred to earlier, it's particularly important, says Chris, for the need to be, these reports to be acted upon urgently, as the damage done to both our now adult children and ourselves cannot be repaired until the truth is known and our suffering acknowledged. Our children need to know that we mothers, many of us still minors, fought our parents and the authorities in the form of police, social workers, maternity staff and the legal system to try and keep them. We did not just walk away without a backward glance, but the system was such that we were traumatised and drugged, and without assistance from anyone, did not have a chance. Only a mother who has walked in our shoes will ever know the powerlessness of our situation. Our children need to know this because they cannot understand in today's world the impossibility of us keeping our babies at the time. The mothers must now have a voice, and government must act urgently to right a wrong. And this has been allowed, this wrong, to continue for too long. Only when an apology is issued will the healing truly begin. Congratulations, Chris, on an excellent documented history of stolen babies, and I'm delighted to launch the book. I've never done a book launch, but you can crack a bottle of everything. Congratulations, Chris.
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for being here. This is an extraordinarily important historic event. And also very special thanks to Mr. Pat Rogan. Let me say that without your assistance and that of your PA Margaret Como, we would never have achieved an inquiry. I wish there were many more politicians like yourself, brave enough to stand up and speak out on behalf of such an emotive and divisive issue, as you aptly named it, the scandal of the stolen white babies. When mothers first started to speak out, they were not believed. People said that stealing babies from white mothers could never have happened in Australia. One early activist mother even received death threats. I remember you yourself, Pat, received a threatening phone call from an irate person who wanted you to leave the issue alone or he was going to punch your teeth out. But to your credit, you pushed on, and other MPs such as Bryce Gaudry, Deidre Grissom and Jill Hall all supported your call for an inquiry into past abuses in adoption. Unfortunately, after the inquiry substantiated mother's claims, the official line shifted from disbelief of the abuses to them being blamed on the social mores of the time. Frankly, I disagree. Most Australians in the 1960s and 1970s would have been as horrified then as they are now that such atrocities happened to young, vulnerable mothers and their babies. The inquiry tabled its final report in the year 2000, and many of the recommendations have not been implemented. I would just like to note some which I feel are very important and which Pat made mention to for both mothers and our children. Recommendation 19, the Minister for Community Services should establish a research grants program for the purpose of investigating the effects of past adoption practice on mothers and the issues surrounding the reunion process. Many mothers and their adult children have such emotional baggage that reunions have become or can become emotional minefields. Recommendation 20, the Minister should establish a public education campaign on the effects of past adoption practices. This is essential because many of us cannot find mental health professionals that have a full understanding of our particular psychological needs. Also, the level of trauma endured by mother and child being separated at birth is now only being fully acknowledged, and its subsequent impact on the lives of adopted persons and their mothers is still not fully understood by the majority of mental health workers. In its final report, the Standing Committee on Social Issues stated that, given the central role of the New South Wales Department of Community Services and the New South Wales Health Department in past adoption practices, the committee considers an apology from these departments would be very important for those still suffering. The importance of an apology cannot be minimised. Many of our Indigenous sisters have stated that hearing an apology from the Prime Minister allowed them to move on and assisted immeasurably with their healing process. I would like the same for us, the non-Indigenous, the white mothers, whose children were likewise stolen. In fact, after 1969, in New South Wales, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous mothers had their babies taken by the same hospital staff, same social workers, under the same laws. We applaud the fact that Indigenous mothers have been apologised to, but why were we excluded? A dear friend of mine gave birth to an Indigenous son. He has been apologised to, she has not. What happened to thousands of mothers and myself was not only criminal, but it was a crime against humanity. And as such, we should be apologised to by the federal government, by our Prime Minister. In every state and territory, mothers had their babies stolen. Adoption laws, rather than being used to protect our rights, were used to take our children. If mothers refused to sign consent, the dispense with consent clause was used and babies were taken anyway. Under the common law, mothers were the guardians of their child and had the right to see, touch and hold their babies. Because adoption was presumed by social policy to be in the best interests of the child of a single mother, adoption professionals used the Act to deprive us of our babies. In Tasmania they did as well under the Mental Deficiency Act. In short, the laws of Australia were used against Australian mothers to remove their children. I cannot understate the importance of an apology for many mothers and their now adult children and grandchildren, for them to be able to move on. I know on a personal level the apology I received from my own mother was extraordinarily healing for both of us. I would just like to read a small part from that from the book. This is a conversation between myself and my mother, fairly recently. Tears welled up in her eyes and she sobbed from a deep place inside. It was dreadful. I didn't help. Really dreadful. Not helping, dreadful. I should have helped you when you asked. I'm sorry. So sorry. Her voice trembled as tears ran down her cheeks. She hugged me and said again how sorry she was and that she loved me. I had waited many years to hear those words. When I told my youngest son that his grandmother had said, she'd said, he commented, "People shortchange when they get old." I replied, "I'm glad they do. People make mistakes, sometimes big ones. But after all, she is my mother and I love her. I don't want to go to my grave holding on to old resentments. The fact that she apologised means a lot to me. She gave me life as my mother, and if you think about it, that's what the book I'm editing is about. The love of a mother for her child." I would like to thank very much all the contributors to the book. For many it was very heart-rendering and a very emotional journey to put once again their stories on paper. Every time we speak our stories, it brings up the old pain. We still need to do a lot of healing, and still needs to be a lot of resolution for the reasons that I've mentioned and Pat's mentioned. The fact that we have not been apologised to, and that our children, when we want our children, our grandchildren to know exactly as Pat said, that they were not just given away, that it wasn't because there was stigma and there was lack of financial funds, that there was a policy of taking babies of single mothers that was systematic in hospitals across Australia, that mothers, once they went into the hospital, were denied their rights to see, hold and touch their babies. They had pillows and sheets put in front of their faces. They were drugged, they were tied to beds, they were abused, they were isolated, they were shunned. This is a shocking part of Australia's history, and it needs to be acknowledged because we don't want it coming back again. Many mothers read in horror the things that are happening in America today in domestic adoptions, with young mothers being abused, with making films that make adoption seem some kind of Pollyanna fairy tale, where the 16-year-old mother can go off and leave her child with just anybody and, sort of be very happy. I mean, this is something we don't want to have repeated in Australia. I never want to see young mothers across this country losing their children losing their mother, their grandchildren then being separated from their grandparents. This goes on and has a ripple effect. It's not just one instance. It happens to the whole extended family. My mother has had to live the rest of her life with the guilt and shame of what she did, and found that very difficult to do. So I'd like to thank very much all the contributors. I'd like to thank my family, my son, his lovely partner, my grandson, who are here tonight, who've been so supportive through this. And I would also like very much to thank Sasko Valentinov. Without Sasko's input, the book would not be the wonderful work of art that it is. He not only designed the amazing cover, but he donated hours of his time and energy to ensure that we had a book that was completely professional on a shoestring budget. So thank you, Sasko, and thanks once again. And I would like to say this launch is also going to launch our campaign to have an apology from our government for past wrongs. Thank you.
Barbara Mason, say a few words. It's a bit tricky, isn't it? How long are we? An hour? 2 hours? 5 minutes. I'll read my story here. In here is 10 pages long, which was far too long to read out. But so I'll just take excerpts out of it that I find totally relevant at the moment. I call my story "I Forgot to Remember to Forget." I'm a real Elvis fan from way back, and he has a beautiful song, "I Forgot to Remember to Forget." And if you think about the words, they're very apt. Now, I met Peter, the love of my life, in 1956. By the time I was 17, I was pregnant. My mother asked me if I was, and I burst into tears, and that started the ball rolling. Mum and Dad went off to the doctors, and he knew conveniently of a family that was looking for a child to adopt. He also knew my son's father's family, so everything was just perfect. And as all abortions then were backyarders, we didn't even consider it. But we wanted our child. We wanted to get married. We loved each other. We didn't know we were young. And we wanted our child despite the inopportune timing, and now knowing our son, I'm so glad. Given the same choice, I don't know if I ever would have had an abortion. But I was sent to the Alexandra Home for Unmarried Mothers, and the sickness benefit partly paid for my board and Mum paid the rest. Dad didn't want to know anything about it. The matron was a formidable, cold person who ran the home very strictly for pregnant girls, but it was a given that you had to give up a baby for adoption to stay in the home. She made it clear that my baby was not my baby. It was a baby for someone else. And if I wanted to stay, I had to agree. I had nowhere else to go. There was a rule of the home that no contact was allowed with the father of the child. But Peter was fully supportive, and we were making plans to try and take our baby home before the worst happened. No one person ever explained any of the options available to us to keep our child. I never knew until 40 years later there was any help available. No one ever told us that after signing the consent papers, we had 30 days to change our minds. Change our minds, we were still planning what days we could take our baby home. And the matron refused to believe if I was in labour, telling me to go back to bed, blah, blah. But luckily I was able to convince the night sister and take him to King Edward Memorial Hospital in the final stages. I desperately wanted some gas, but I was told I was too late. And finally, I'll read it as I've written it. A sharp, white, hot, tearing pain, and then suddenly I felt the most beautiful feeling of relief as he slithered hotly and wetly out of me, all wet and warm. I heard someone say, "It's a boy," and I cried, great gulping sobs. "Come on, don't be silly, dear, it's all over now. Pull yourself together. No need for tears, you'll be back in the ward in no time and you can have a nice sleep, it's all over now." Little did she know the pain was just starting. This was merely the beginning. Even at the hospital I'd been told to keep away from the nursery. It was forbidden to those like me. Other mothers in the ward had their children brought to them to feed. I had to sit there and watch or wait while the curtains were pulled around. Another distortion of the truth, more just that little face on my mind. I was desperate to capture it before he was gone. I can see that tiny face every day. I will always be grateful to that unknown nurse and would love to thank her for that gift, one of the most precious I've ever received. If it wasn't for her compassion and the risk she took disobeying orders to show one of those babies, name cards marked A for adoption, we would have had nothing to take with us. I had given birth to a child till I was able to make application for 35 years later. At the time for the completion of the birth registration form, the almoner came and took details for the registration of his birth. To her annoyance and against her wishes and advice, I insisted that his father's name be put on the birth certificate registration papers and spoke to him face to face. I could finally give him a birthday gift. He hadn't known he was adopted.